58,220. That's the staggering number of U.S. service members who lost their lives in a brutal conflict that dragged on for 2 decades. Welcome to this explainer on the Vietnam War. We're diving straight into the causes, the massive escalation, and the devastating long-term consequences of this historic conflict. Let's get right into it. Part 1. Origins of the divide right after the French exit. This conflict didn't just appear out of nowhere. It actually grew right out of the ashes of the First Indochina War. Back in 1954, after French colonial rule collapsed, the Geneva Conference temporarily split Vietnam right at the 17th parallel. So you had the communist Viet Minh up in the north and a Western-aligned government down in the south. Just a year later, in 1955, the U.S. Military Assistance Advisory Group was set up in Vietnam. This officially kicked off America's deep involvement. And wow, things moved fast. Fast forward just 10 years to 1965, and we see active U.S. combat units fully deployed on the ground. And the geographic scale of all this, it was absolutely immense. The partitioned borders were really just the tip of the iceberg. Think about the Ho Chi Minh Supply Trail. These vital communist supply routes stretched deep through neighboring Laos and Cambodia. So this fighting wasn't neatly contained to just one country. It spilled over borders and essentially turned the entire Indochina region into a massive, heavily contested war zone. The combatants involved quickly turned what could have been a regional dispute into a full-blown global showdown. On one side, you've got North Vietnam and the Viet Cong insurgents, and they were heavily backed by major communist powers like the Soviet Union and China. Their ultimate goal? Unifying the whole country under a single communist regime. Then, on the other side, South Vietnam was fighting to preserve a Western-aligned nation. And they certainly weren't fighting alone. They had massive international backing, primarily from the United States, but also drawing in forces from South Korea, Australia, Thailand, and New Zealand. Part 2. The escalation into a Cold War proxy. The sheer scale of militarization here is just staggering to think about. By the peak of the conflict, right around 1967 to 1968, South Vietnamese and Allied forces combined swelled to over 1.4 million personnel. They were mobilized to counter a deeply entrenched communist force of roughly 860,000 fighters from North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. So what started as a war of national liberation rapidly morphed into a deadly proxy war between Cold War superpowers. It literally pulled millions of soldiers onto the battlefield. By April 1969, the United States alone hit an unprecedented deployment level, a peak of 543,400 military personnel stationed on the ground. Part 3. The turning point, the Tet Offensive and guerrilla war. Now on the ground, the reality was incredibly brutal. Heavy U.S. firepower was constantly meeting fierce, highly entrenched guerrilla tactics. U.S. Marines were relentlessly bombing bunkers and these incredibly expansive, complex tunnel systems that the Viet Cong used to hide and launch surprise attacks. It was a grueling, claustrophobic style of warfare, and it set the stage for major turning points, most notably the 1968 Tet Offensive. That event fundamentally changed the momentum of the war, and it completely shifted the American public's perception of whether progress was actually being made. Part 4. The divide at home and growing opposition. Because as the violence escalated abroad, it generated this massive, deeply polarized divide back in the United States. By 1967, you had students, intellectuals, clergy members, all beginning to loudly protest the war. They were pointing to the increasingly horrific number of civilian casualties on both sides. Many raised serious moral objections, arguing that the U.S. was essentially propping up a corrupt and oppressive dictatorship in Saigon. So this really wasn't just a military struggle happening overseas. It fractured the very fabric of American society, causing profound domestic political divisions that played out in huge protests across the nation. Part 5. The human cost, a staggering toll. Ultimately, the most enduring legacy of this conflict is its absolutely horrific human cost. The numbers are hard to even process. As many as 2 million civilians perished in this war. Alongside them, over 1.1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters died. The South Vietnamese military saw between 200,000 and 313,000 fatalities, and the U.S. and its allies lost around 60,000 troops. The human tragedy here impacted every single faction involved. It literally devastated an entire generation. And the devastation, it extended far beyond the battlefield itself. 20%. That's the portion of South Vietnam's jungle that was heavily sprayed with toxic herbicides, most notably Agent Orange by U.S. forces.
This chemical defoliation was designed to strip away the enemy's jungle cover, but the fallout was catastrophic. It led to massive, long-lasting health problems and severe environmental ruin that continued to plague the region long after the guns fell silent.
Eventually, the immense human and financial costs simply proved too much to bear. By 1973, facing enormous pressure at home and a grinding, bloody stalemate abroad, the U.S. withdrew its active combat units following the Paris Peace Accords. And then, just 2 years later, without that American military backing, South Vietnam was fully invaded by the North. Saigon fell in 1975, unifying the country under a single communist government. Part 6. The Legacy and the Lessons of the War. Today, half a century later, the geopolitical lessons of Vietnam remain incredibly relevant. A core takeaway here is the absolute necessity of confronting the domestic ramifications of foreign war. Understanding this history allows us, as viewers, voters, and citizens, to critically examine the assumptions and the pressures that drive nations to war in the first place. It forces us to look squarely at the profound ways foreign conflicts fracture our societies back home. Which brings us to a final thought. As we face today's interconnected, globalized challenges, we really have to ask ourselves, how do the underlying motivations that lead a nation into conflict shape the devastating impacts left behind long after the fighting stops? Keep that question in mind as you explore international relations today. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.